Hi all, and welcome to the article continuation, part 2, scientific research limitations in the sport and health sciences and how it applies to stretching. The second part. Sorry, just trying to get this to scroll a little bit. There we go. All right, introduction. So I'm talking a little bit about my impetus for writing this article in the first place. And here it is. I was on Instagram today. That was the day that I wrote the article. This guy from Australia who actually owns a strength performance facility puts up a post about stretching being useless for injury resistance or performance because he read a research paper. I have read that paper, though it is lengthy. What? Really? Every animal does stretches as an instinct. Look at babies. Look at your dog or cat, or on the Discovery Channel. Mammals stretch. Shaolin priests, dancers, and every athlete ever. I healed my debilitating back pain that plagued me for years because of my lack of mobility with stretching. I've helped many others on a day-by-day basis for 20 years rid themselves of chronic pain using stretch and associated methods. So stretch is a part of the equation. It's not the full equation, but it is, and that's what I do for a living. So it's kind of kind of bothered me to see this by from a guy who works in the industry and actually owns the place from down in Australia. Anyways, I actually hear this kind of crap from a lot of the non-critically thinking frittatas in my industry that just like to spew out opinions against traditional methods. It's easy. Read an article. Did it come from the NIH or NCBI website? Yes. Regurgitate. Look, folks, I can read. So that's how I envision those folks when they read something. They just read it, regurgitate, and they really think about the process that goes into research, and whether whether you need to think a little bit more critically about why it's showing one thing versus another. So it's an interesting problem. The main certification agencies of the NSCA and ACSM in sports science education always give recommendations to stretch. But then they follow up those recommendations with, in quotations, but research shows no association with injury prevention or performance. That's fine, at least they recommend it. But why is something that is inherently true in experience not measurable in experimentation? So we're looking to answer that question. The problem is dual. It lies in one, the limitations of research, which we talked about in the part 1 article, and 2, the nature of mobility. So let's look at 2 first. Mobility is different than other physical qualities. Once you have enough of it, you're good. This is unlike strength or cardiovascular capacity that reaches its upper limit by genetics and training. Those qualities are very measurable performance-wise as well. There's limited work associated with mobility. To illustrate this difference, let's look at the following research in strength and performance. From research and practice from strength and sprint coaches. So this is showing research. These research articles were put out, and they were connecting what would happen if you were to squat heavy, 3 reps, 4 reps right before you did, right before you ran the 100-meter dash. And what we came up with was, in terms of intensity, it's been shown that performing a set of submaximal squats at a low rep count can increase short sprint performance. So if you're going for 100 yards, 40 yards, 50 yards, maybe even 200 yards, sprint performance increases with preloading of a squat, of a heavy squat. That would be 3 reps or less. How would this work if we did 100 reps of push-ups or air squats for that matter? How would one of those types of measurements how would one put those types of measurements towards a stretch? So what we're talking about here is like, if you say squat, well, you know, there was other variables involved with how they did those squats prior to doing, um, prior to performing the sprint. Whereas when they measured stretch, there wasn't so many variables done with that. They didn't apply those variables in these articles that we read. So how do you measure other training variables in stretch? Volume, intensity, don't those matter? Even balance and stabilization, for the purpose of this article, we are separating these from mobility. I consider balance stabilization to be subcomponents or elements of mobility. But for the purpose of this article, we're having those separate. So even balance and stabilization have external performance qualities that improve sport performance and injury resilience in a direct relationship with the improvement of those qualities. With mobility, though, once your joints acquire a certain range of motion needed for the tasks as capable by the joint structure, injury risk by lack of mobility or tissue restriction is diminished, meaning that as long as you have the mobility that is required for the performance of the task at hand by the joint that we're talking about, then yeah, you're fine. There's not a greater component that's needed, like, in terms of like strength or cardiovascular or something like that, that's exponential in its ability to go up. As a matter of fact, more mobility may increase the risk of injury in some cases for some tasks. So a general mobility should be attained for health, and a mobility as related to the performance of a task should be analyzed. How much stretching of the shoulder joint is appropriate for a quarterback before a game? How much stretching of the shoulder is appropriate for an average Joe or Jane with upper body postural issues? So you see, we would approach it, though, both those instances quite differently. But in the research, they do not account for the pre-existing relationship of mobility to task. If mobility is not lacking in a participant of the experiment, then stretching may not help, but it may hurt. On the other hand, if mobility is lacking, an injury may not occur in a singular instance during an experiment or even a longer-term study. How do these experiments associate injury with stretch? Muscle groups? Do they analyze concepts such as the kinetic chain of fascia or antagonistic inhibition associated with their experiment? The answer is they can't. Another limitation is that research in this area typically fails to express specific time frames between the stretching and the events, as well as other activities that may be done in conjunction with the stretching. So if I'm going to go and I stretch the Achilles tendon prior to doing a 100-meter sprint, then I would expect that I would have, if we're going to do Achilles stretch 100% as far as I can go, and then 100-meter sprint, I'm going to expect a drop in my ability, in my performance of that sprint. However, if I do a 50% capacity Achilles stretch 1 hour before performing a 100-meter sprint, I would expect that I actually relieve some of the tissue restriction that may be, actually impeding performance. So those are the nuances that we cannot see in experimentation because of individual differences. Anyways, stretching is a part of proprioceptive development and training. In training, it should be combined with strength reactivity and balance stabilization for injury resilience and performance enhancement. To isolate stretching as a variable and come up with accurate information as to how it works in real life is an exercise in futility. All in all, the impact of a method of development on physiology is sometimes better understood from somebody who has been using that method as a professional or an individual than it is from a paper, article, or some other academic or intellectual source. So there we go, folks. I hope that is just food for thought for you in your approach towards your own or others' strength and conditioning or health programs. And if you want to comment or, discuss or anything like that, go ahead and enter it in the comments down below if you're on YouTube, or, send me an email, whatever. I love to discuss this type of stuff. And hopefully all these articles and stuff that I put out there, they really are just impetus for discussion. Try to get people talking about these things. So thanks a lot. Talk to you soon.